Welcome back to another episode of the Underworld Podcast. Thank you all for joining us. I am here with Ioan Grillo, just someone we've wanted to have on since we started this. Honestly, you're probably a better person to be doing this podcast than me. Reported on the drug war, on narco trafficking, on everything in Mexico for the past 20 years, all over the world. Your books, too, have been, I think, a major inspiration for myself and other people that cover this stuff, whether it's El Narco, which to me is, I think, one of the best books, if not the best book on the cartel wars in Mexico, Gangster Warlords, and now Blood, Gun, and Money. Or Blood, Gun, Money, sorry.
Yeah, they're great to be here, Dan. And I'm a big fan of your stuff as well. And yeah, really good to see the issues you're bringing to with the podcast. So yeah, great to be here with you.
Yeah, I want to talk to you. There's so many things. I mean, we could do a separate episode on each one of your books, on the reporting you've done in Mexico and everything like that. But I think we want to just kind of get started. Can you kind of tell us how you ended up in Mexico reporting on these issues? Because I think you've been there for a couple of decades now, yeah?
Yeah, I've been here 20 years in Mexico now. So yeah, 2 decades. So when I was 27, I began, I came to Mexico when I was 27 and began reporting. And I had an idea then about reporting internationally in different countries. And back then, there was still this way into journalism was to start an English language newspaper and then kind of work your way from there. And I had met other people, knew other British people who'd done this. So I found out there was this newspaper in Mexico City called The News, the Mexico City News. So I came here and got a job. It took me a couple of months to get a job at The News. And that's where I started with the kind of idea of being here a couple of years. And very quickly, I fell into reporting on drugs and drug cartels, partly because I grew up around a huge amount of drugs, drug use, drug overdoses, in a city which is famous for its drug consumption, Brighton in England, but also in a time in the 80s, early 90s, it was a big time for kind of opioid epidemic back then. So I had, a couple of friends. I knew 4 teenagers, young men who died of heroin overdoses back then. So for me, it was kind of very interesting right away to see the link between a drug consuming culture, place, and a drug producing and trafficking place. And I was kind of fascinated in the early days by the stories of drug kingpins, by the songs, by this mythology. Initially, it seemed this exciting, fun thing. But then over the years, it became something which is very sad and very tragic. I found myself in situations I couldn't have imagined. I found myself, with rooms full of, a morgue with 49 bodies that had all been decapitated, all had their hands and feet cut off. What was I covering? And it was like a humanitarian catastrophe that's been in Mexico over the last couple of decades.
Did you have any sort of premonition or any idea that when you started covering this, it was going to become what it is right now?
I didn't, and you look back and you see these historical things. So I identify the period of 2004, 2005 on the Mexican border, Nuevo Laredo, which I was covering for the Houston Chronicle then, the Texas newspaper. And that was when you started seeing the real explosion of violence. And I see that as the beginning of the modern Mexican drug war, Mexico's drug war, la narco guerra del narco in Mexico. The beginning right there. And then Calderon, when Felipe Calderon in 2006 sent the military against the cartels, it was reacting to the rising violence. But at the time, I didn't know at the time that was coming. There was a moment when I did see that this is really going to destabilize the country. And I remember quite clearly a moment in 2008 when I was in Sinaloa covering the violence there. And I went to a small town, a village really called El Pozo, where there'd been 2 massacres consecutively. And people were leaving the village in a convoy of pickup trucks with all of their possessions. And seeing that was like, wow, it was kind of like people, it was like refugees leaving this town. And that was a kind of, realizing this is something, this is really something really big is happening. there's so many of these crazy things happening, but that was something, one of these moments that something crazy is happening that can really destabilize the country.
It's almost shocking to me. Look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the U.S. media doesn't cover what's happening in Mexico. It definitely does. We've got TV shows, we've got documentaries and whatever else. But when you really look at the numbers, when you look at the statistics and also what's happening to the country, it almost seems like there's just not enough cover. It's shocking to me. When you really, what is it, top 50 cities, how many of them are in Mexico in terms of murder rates and numbers, like the sheer scale of what's going on. It's crazy.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that it got bigger coverage in the period of 2009, 10, 11. And right before Syria kicked off, I mean, if you consider the Mexican cartel-related violence and the military cracking down on them, if you consider this being an armed conflict, for a couple of years then it was the most homicidal armed conflict in the world. Now, there's a lot of debate about how you can consider an armed conflict when you've got, it's a very, very messy situation. But then Syria happened and it overtook it, and then the old Arab Spring happened. But also it was something, so for a while you had all the kind of war correspondents at Iraq and Afghanistan that got kind of old. They're all kind of arriving in Mexico. There was, this people, TV crews I would work with, but then they would come in just from Afghanistan, Iraq, and they'd have these ideas and they'd be covering this very, very different situation. And it was something, it was new for a while then. It was something, this was really surprising. And there was a fear, I think, among various people here that how far this could destabilize the country. When you saw this increase in the violence so quickly, from 2,000 to 17,000 supposed cartel-related murders in a year, rapidly over a couple of years, where could this go? And then we saw over the years that this thing kind of got old from a news point of view. You start covering the same thing. So, I remember, one telling moment, this is back some years when I was working for the news agency AP, and there was a message saying, we're not going to cover single decapitations anymore because they're just so common. Only if they're really big, major decapitations or they have some real kind of feature.
Jesus.
So the first time, when La Familia Michoacana in those days threw 5 decapitated heads into a disco dance floor in Michoacan, then that was global news. And then, by the time it went up and, it was 5, 12, 14, 18, and got to the 49. And then it's how can that be any more? So now you have these massacres happening and it doesn't become big news anymore. And people just simply used to, in the United States and globally, I think, just used to saying, you hear 20 people were killed in Mexico yesterday. It's just not a big news story anymore. And also I think, although the violence accelerated and you had these crazy things like the self-defense, autodefensa movement, the vigilantes rising up and, all these different crazy things happening, the country didn't collapse. The country just lived with this violence. So now we've had 15 years of this violence and 200,000 murders maybe due to this, 60,000, 70,000 disappearances due to this. But the country still just plods on. It lives around this level of violence now.
I've reported in Mexico a bit here and there. I try to keep abreast of what's going on. I know some of the major players and all that, but it's just so hard to get a grasp on the situation. Can you kind of give us a broad overview of what's happening right now?
Among the cartels. So you've had different phases in this, and the current phase right now. So if we go back a bit, we had the kind of phase of the cartels really spreading and really gaining power. At the same time, the violence erupting really hard among them. And this was very much linked to a breakdown of the corruption system that the previous governments had. So you still had crazy corruption, but it was not unified. And you can compare this a little bit to what happened in the period in Eastern Europe, Russia, in the kind of wild 90s, they called it, when you had a breakdown of quite an authoritarian system. And then you had all these kind of gangsters and corruption, but they weren't on the same side. And you had kind of quite a crazy period there. But in Mexico, you had that, but they just got more and more powerful, hiring, fighting amongst themselves. and fighting for control of chunks of the government apparatus. So you saw this and the militarized crackdown by Felipe Calderón. And then you had Enrique Peña Nieto came in, and he had this kind of idea of his policy. One of his policies was changing the narrative. That was one of his. I mean, this is discussed in their circles. You change the narrative. You don't talk about cartels anymore. There are no cartels anymore. Tell mayors, tell governors, don't talk about narcos. Don't put the guys on TV. So I mean, again, that does change the impression.
Yeah.
But it blew up in his face when you had then, you had the disappearance of 43 student teachers.
Yeah, I remember that.
Allegedly at the hand of a cartel, corrupt police, and then it breaks down, and then all the violence keeps on going up again. And so you have that. Then we have the current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who had this idea, or he had these two kind of contradictory ideas, or two slightly at odds ideas. One with this idea of it's time for peace, it's time to end the war. He said, "Hugs, not bullets," was a phrase that he's often quoted as, which is balazos, abrazos, no balazos. And this idea, the war's over, we're going to have peace now. And so he had that idea, and doesn't really mean much, didn't really come to much solid policy, apart from some of this kind of standing back and not really hitting the cartels as much, or very unclear. And the other side of his policy was this idea of restore the national state, and he has this new militarized police force called the National Guard, which you see growing and growing now around Mexico. And that, we'll see how much effect that has. But that's kind of part of his policy. And then the cartels themselves, for a long time, you had these big names, these gangsters who were kind of being seen, like El Chapo, the Viceroy, Tony Tormenta, El Mas Loco, the maddest one. All of these gangsters really flaunting, really being kind of names that people would see and know, and having these quite crazy battles around. And you've seen most of those guys taken down now. They're either dead or in prison. Obviously, El Chapo's extradited and now in the Supermax in the United States. And a lot of these people were killed in military operations, police operations, often in very dubious circumstances. But the cartels are still there, but we don't know in a lot of these cartels who really is running them anymore. So they're kind of more like hidden figures. It's not as good now to be on the TV. And we've seen in a lot of cartels a process of fragmentation. So as these cartels were hit by the government or in these internal wars, then suddenly the cartel breaks into two, and then the fragments break up.
Right, you see that with like Sinaloa, right? Like all those sort of stories about Los Chapitos and the other guys kind of fighting with each other. Yeah.
I mean, the Chapitos are they're probably one of the stronger, bigger still factions, but you get these like cartels in places like Guerrero, which are the kind of fragments of the fragments of the fragments. So it's kind of like you had the Sinaloa cartel, and the Beltran-Leyva cartel broke away from them, and then the Guerreros Unidos broke away from them, and then you have these kind of. So then you get these like cartels. I call them cartelitos. These kind of ones which will control, a municipality, a few towns in these places. Sometimes run by like really young guys. These people you see they're 23, 24 years old.
Yeah, it sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Even more of a disaster than a cartel normally is. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, this guy, this guy, El Güero Palaya, one of these guys in Guerrero, is like some, kid. He was like 23, and he had like hundreds of these, real young kids following him with all their, they've got AK-47s and they're controlling the territory, and they're, But so you get like violence, and these people still running these various rackets which have long diversified into a whole portfolio of criminal rackets. So you've got the drugs still are huge, but you've also got the shakedowns, the wildcat mining, prostitution, the people trafficking, people smuggling, everyone going through the undocumented migrants, getting money from that business. Kidnapping, piracy. You've got all of these criminal rackets they're into. So you've got this various, like a whole ecosystem of kind of criminals out there and gangs and doing this with various alliances with government, police forces, and politicians. And then you still got some big big players out there as well. Like, I mean, you've got like the Chapitos you mentioned. I mean, the Sinaloa Cartel are still big international players. You've got the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which has really gained fame or gained infamy in recent years, for just being a whole bunch of places and a huge amount of armaments. So you've got the both at the same time. You've got both the fragmented gangsters, gangster chieftains, lower the gangster warlords, the gangster chieftains, and then you've still got these huge, cartels and with huge amounts of firepower. And we've seen as my new book's about the firepower of the guns. I mean, we've seen just an enormous amount, an increase in the firepower from the 50 cals to the rocket propelled grenades to weaponized drones, and really the kind of the real killers though are the AK-47s and the AR-15s.
Right, and you mentioned that in the new book. I think you start off with talking about being at covering Chapo's trial, and the weapons that they were showing at that trial.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So the I covered some of Chapo's trial, which was a crazy show. Like right there in New York and Brooklyn, and a kind of accumulation. That was kind of like accumulation of in some ways of the whole drug war going back to the 70s. I mean, that trial there, because the DEA were involved in some levels with against Pablo Escobar. That was really a Colombian takedown, and they'd had various, a whole bunch of drug traffickers the DEA got, but El Chapo was the big prize for his infamy. I mean, not necessarily translated really for his wealth or the number of people he has employed. It's really his infamy, the kind of myth of El Chapo there. So that trial was the show, and that was was a crazy show. They put 3 months of trial and claimed he made $14 billion, and put 50 witnesses out there. 14 of his, put Colombians, Mexicans, all of his kind of, cartel members against him. But a kind of side note in that trial, but a big deal was the guns they documented there. And so they brought out, a bunch of the firearms in the trial into the courtroom. They brought out AK-47s. They brought out rocket-propelled grenade launchers. And this was like the weapons of El Chapo, and the fact that the Sinaloa Cartel were also, or are also major firearms and gun traffickers, arms traffickers, as well as drugs traffickers. And so, and then follow that line into the whole, in the book Blood Gun Money, into the whole gun trafficking networks, which you realize just, spiral across the United States, but also reach out to the AK-47s being made in Eastern Europe, imported to the United States, pushed down into Latin America, and the whole networks of guns being trafficked around U.S. cities.
Yeah, I think in the book it sounds like you're everywhere. I think we even talked a while ago about going to Central African Republic, but here you're in Transylvania, you're in Baltimore, you're along the border, and the way it's broken up into you're spending time with biker gangs, you're spending time with gangsters in Baltimore, you're spending time in Latin America, obviously. How do you decide to take on a project like this? What makes you decide to say, okay, I'm going to dive into looking at actually where these guns are coming from?
Yeah, I mean, the gun story is something I've been looking at, and many people have been looking at for some years. I mean, I've written stories about gun trafficking to Mexico all the way back in 2005. I did stories on this. So, it's a story that people knew about for a long time, this issue of guns coming from the US. But for a long time, I want to go deeper into this. How is the gun trafficking industry really working internationally? How is this thing really functioning? Not just the basic stuff of, okay, people are buying guns in the US, taking them to Mexico, but really getting deeper into this. And how is this kind of weird thing of merging of crime and war that we see in Mexico and in various places of Latin America, where we have militarized federal police and cartel members dressing in combat gear and with kind of militarized thing fighting them. How is that playing out, and really, how is that working? So I've been looking at this for some years, and then I was doing some work on the border and interviewed a firearms trafficker in prison in Ciudad Juarez. And for a long time, I thought, well, the US firearms story is interesting, but it's kind of a brick wall. because gun rights are so strong in the United States, and we can't really change this, just a kind of brick wall. And then when I interviewed this firearms trafficker in prison in Ciudad Juarez, and he explained how he was buying guns in Dallas, and he was driving every weekend, going over from the border from Ciudad Juarez, going into Texas, going to Dallas, buying about a dozen guns every weekend, mostly AR-15s in his case, and driving back. And he was doing it with no ID whatsoever. He was just like buying the guns at the shows with no ID.
So welcome to America.
Yeah. So we went up to the gun show in Dallas, one of his gun shows. Massive sprawling gun shows there, and we're taping it, and I know hidden recorders, which is legal in Texas. You can do that, and we realized what it was the private sale loophole. So we kind of misunderstood a bit the kind of idea of in a gun show, because like most people in the gun show are regular gun license dealers and will still ask you for ID, but it was the private sale loophole there, which was people saying, well, they're just regular collectors and they can sell a gun and they don't need to ask for any ID, take cash, they can do whatever, and there's no ID. But we realized there's people there doing this who were selling brand new AR-15s, who had big piles of brand new AR-15s on their tables. So I was realizing, well, there is ground that can be gained on this issue. It's not only about the idea you need like an assault rifle ban. There are things involved in the private sale loopholes. There are things involved in how straw buyers are buying guns. There are things involved in how the theft is being done so easily. And there's ground that can be made, which is not about attacking the law-abiding gun owners. It's not about saying, your right to bear arms has to be stopped. It's like saying, well, there's criminal operations happening here exploiting these things. And how can there be things tightened up? And then, the idea with, universal background checks, which is, according to polls, supported by the majority of Americans and the majority of gun owners in very, very high levels. And how come these things haven't been done? How come you're really letting, cartel affiliates drive into and buying, every weekend 12 AR-15s and taking them back and making some good money on that? I mean, this guy was buying AR-15s for $600, $700 a piece, selling them for $2,000 a piece down there in Chihuahua. So you can do the maths on that and see how much he was making. It was a good business for him. And then, so kind of tracing this, I got into this and following this trail of guns. Like you said, I was thinking at one point of really going global about this was going, but then I focused the book on the gun trafficking in the Americas and basically the huge amount of guns going to the gangs, the cartels in the Americas. But then you see, what's happening in the United States, in Baltimore, Maryland. I did the research there and found the gun traffickers. I found a guy who was bringing guns into Baltimore and selling them there, and he was buying them in Georgia. He was buying them in various places in states with liberal laws and bringing them in. And how he was exploiting the straw purchase element. So that in the straw purchase, paying somebody to go and buy a gun, and then they buy it in their name and they give it to them. Now, one of the crazy things about the straw purchasing is that they'll often pay somebody $100 to buy a gun, or they'll buy a bunch of guns. I mean, there's a case I've got documented where a guy was paid $600 to walk in and buy 10 AK-47s, so $60 a gun. And the reason that they can pay so little is because most of the time when they catch a straw purchaser, the only crime is lying on the form. Straw purchasing itself is not actually a crime. The crime is lying on the form. So, some of the agents were saying, well, all they have to do is just and the recommended sentencing guideline for this is probation. So that same guy, he was caught with buying 10 AK-47s. They went to the Zetas cartel. One of them was used to kill an American agent, and he got probation for that. So just increasing the sentencing guidelines. So say if you buy a gun for a drug cartel, you're going to get some more serious punishment than simply lying the form. Then that could really
slap on the wrist.
That could hit this really high. Now we also have, and people are going to hit back, we have these crazy cases like Fast and Furious, which I go into in the book in a lot of detail.
I think that's one of the ones when you talk about this that always gets brought up. Can you kind of break down a little bit about what that was for people who might not know?
Yeah, absolutely. So Fast and Furious, a case that happened in 2009, 2010 out of Arizona with the ATF. The ATF are the gun police, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives. And they were following guns being trafficked by cartel operatives out of Phoenix into Mexico. And they had the idea of, well, we're going to let the guns walk. So, criminals run guns, governments walk guns. That's the funny kind of terminology here. We're gonna let the guns walk, and we're gonna follow them and build up a big case. We're gonna build up the big case, and it's gonna be a real big sweep. And they were letting these guns walk, and then it got really out of control. I mean, close to 2,000 guns were documented as going from the shops. I mean, there's single cases of individuals spending $500,000 in gun shops and buying guns and taking to the cartel.
Jesus.
And the government's watching this. And the stuff was kind of getting out of hand, and then eventually there was a elite border patrol agent from the elite BORTAC unit, which has come up recently in Portland.
Yeah.
So one of these guys from the BORTAC who was over on the border checking, following what they call this cartel rip crews, is the way that they call them. Basically a bunch of gangsters who were like robbing drug traffickers and robbing undocumented migrants and stuff. Some kind of bunch of gangsters over on the border in southern Arizona, and they got into a shootout with the BORTAC, and they killed a BORTAC agent. And it turned out a couple of this gun they had had been one of these ones sold through Fast and Furious. So this really blew up and became a big scandal. And there's been guns traced to El Chapo's safe houses, guns traced down as far as Colombia from the operation. The guns are still turning up. I mean, still a lot of these guns. Most of these guns have not been accounted for, and they're still showing up in murder scenes. The sad thing, I mean, it got extremely politicized. It became part of the narrative of kind of the federal government is. I mean, it happened under Barack Obama. So it became very much a kind of conservative narrative of this is, Obama's giving guns to cartels, look what they're doing.
It went through the spin cycle.
And it was, it was a bad operation. It was certainly a bad operation how things went down there. And so this, it got pushed very much in. But the sad thing is that, huge amounts of guns are being trafficked today. The ATF stepped back and it was like, okay, no, you can't, anytime these guns, you've got to grab them right away. But then people are still not getting any time for this stuff, and the gun trafficking is still happening in a massive way.
Yeah, I find, it's kind of, I've reported a lot on murder in the U.S. I did a bunch of stuff in St. Louis where the murder rate there is out of control.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting how, you present solutions in your books, which I think a lot of reporters don't. But the situation here is you're not trying to talk about anything, it's like you said, gun control in this country is a brick wall. You're actually presenting solutions that it just involve laws being enforced that would significantly cut down on all of these things. Yeah,
I mean, you have to ask yourself sometimes when you're covering this, how many dead bodies can you see? You go to murder scene after murder scene after murder scene. How many, mothers can you talk to are crying about their innocent son being dragged away by gunmen? How many people fleeing communities, people being traumatized? I mean, the violence I document in the book. In the new book, I include like a girl, a 12-year-old. One of the things that really got me, still, get me, even though I've been covering this for 20 years, and you get very cold to this violence and suffering. But then there's a story of a girl in Honduras who I saw at 12 years old was hit by a stray bullet and paralyzed.
Oh, there's a photo of her in the book, right?
Yeah, exactly. She's paralyzed, and she was She's now 14 when I talk to her, and she's living in one of the most murderous neighborhoods in the Americas, in San Pedro Sula, in a very gang neighborhood. It's very hard anyway, and she's living through that, being paralyzed in a wheelchair, not going to school because there's no facilities, spending all day just lying down watching TV. Her life, being destroyed, and you see that kind of thing really brings out. So how can we, if we're reporting on this stuff, how can we try and find solutions to this? I talk about this, some of these the gun stuff. Like I say, for a long time I thought, well, the problem with the guns is that Americans love guns, Americans want guns, and in a way that I haven't got a problem with that. People have firearms for self-defense. People have even there's a debate about that, but they have firearms for hunting. But there's still issues you could do, like you really want those same guns going to gang members. I mean, if you're against MS-13, then do you really want the fact that cartel affiliates, gang affiliates can be buying all these guns?
Yeah.
And the issue, and then you get to other come to so many issues in the United States. I mean, the issue of violence that you've been covering in the American cities, and there's such a high level of guns, such a high level of violence, then that brings into the justification by the government for more militarized policing. So then that gets to the deaths, which gets into the whole of the protests and Black Lives Matter. So all of these things are so connected.
Yeah. And
then the drug war itself, which also I've long been a critic of the drug war itself. I push out solutions. I find it, it's frustrating. There are some things, I think you see little gains here and there. I feel it's frustrating. I think a lot of people don't want to look for solutions. They don't want to look for how these things can get better. They're happy to, in a way, criticize it without looking for ways we could actually try and change these things, because it's kind of frustrating how this carries on every day with someone suffering.
It's hard though, because I'm pretty vocal about my thoughts on gun control, having covered, places like North St. Louis, where you have an astonishing number of deaths, like on a level unseen anywhere else in the developed world. I think you talk about this, and it's one of the things that really struck with me in the beginning of the book. You mentioned how the U.S. has the highest homicide rate in the world for any developed nation. It's far higher than other places. People don't want to look at why that is, but the reality is pretty clear. But the U.S. also has strong state institutions, strong law enforcement institutions, even with it being as high as it is in a place like North St. Louis, which can feel abandoned sometimes, or parts of Baltimore. And then you look at Latin America, where you don't have those strong state institutions. You don't have those strong sort of law enforcement institutions. And is there any wonder that 47 out of the top 50 most murderous cities in the world are located in, the Americas? Of course. It's just absurd that people don't want to draw these connections onto why that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's that point. In the United States, you've got these paradoxes or contradictions that you have, huge amount of guns, it's enormous drug market in the US, a lot of organized crime in the United States. A huge amount of organized crime in the United States. A huge amount of gangs in the United States. But at the same time, you've got this really hard militarized police forces, prison system with, more 2 million plus inside incarcerated. And they do hit, and, using the...
Yeah, they don't fuck around.
Yeah, using the RICO, using these kind of things. So gangsters in the United States are more scared about killing police officers than they are. They know if I kill a police officer, you talk to gang members, they'll say, if I, kill a police officer, you don't do that. That's going to bring heat down everybody. Whereas you get down to Mexico, you get to Central America, you get to South America, you've got these gangs, the guns, the drug markets, but then these really weak, corrupt institutions of the state. So then you get the gangsters can get away with killing police officers, with having them on their payroll, the controlling prisons, with going into prisons where you see people with Uzis inside prisons. I saw that in San Pedro Sula, Honduras. People sitting there with Uzis on their chests and fighting dogs inside the prison. One of the craziest things I've seen. And you see then what that really looks like, where then when you see very violent societies, where there's a lot of suffering, and it makes. Yeah, I mean, it's disturbing. I grew up in the UK, and I grew up with very different attitudes. I grew up anti-police. I grew up, I was into punk rock and these kind of things, and it's very different. You see, well, how I thought when I was a teenager, when I was into that stuff, I maybe had pretty easy illusions about the world and stuff. And you see the reality of when things are really messed up and how people suffer in these societies.
Yeah, I mean, that's always been my thing with guns too. Once I enjoy shooting. I like going out and shooting. I got a lot of friends that hunt and stuff like that. But when you really see what our lack of gun control, how it affects certain communities, it's not fun and games there. So you kind of, that's what changed my perspective. But yeah, I'm excited to read the book. I think, one of the things I've always really liked about your writing too is you bring this great on the ground perspective. You're on the front lines of these situations. You're talking to all the players involved, not just law enforcement, but the gangsters. You're getting great sources, but you also bring in a really fantastic history. I didn't get a chance to dive too far into Blood, Gun, Money, but I'm sure I think I saw some parts there about the history of guns and automatic weapons and things like that. And El Narco, I keep talking about it because it really is one of the quintessential books on the cartels, on the drugs in the drug war in general in America. And I was always fascinated by the part, and in Mexico, by the part where you talk about how opium plants actually got to Mexico and how that morphed and the end of prohibition and all that. So I was kind of hoping you would break that down for people who haven't read the book.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, I love history. I studied history at college, and I'm a lover of history and really going back and trying to make sense of this. So in Anarcho, when I document the Mexican drug trade and the roots of it going back, then you see the beginning of it with Chinese immigrants into Mexico, working with Chinese immigrants in the United States in the early 20th century. So the Chinese, there was an issue of opium, which was also enforced by the Brits. Could take some responsibility for that. The first drug cartel really is the British Navy enforcing selling opium in China. And so you have a lot of use among Chinese people in the time of opium. And when they immigrate to Sinaloa, Mexico, to work in railroad construction and in mines in Sinaloa, they bring opium with them. And there's photos of opium dens in Culiacan, Sinaloa, dominated by Chinese people in this period. Are really interesting photos to look at. And the plant takes root in the mountains there. And some of the very earliest deals, you see these Chinese Mexicans bringing over opium to other Chinese immigrant community in California, and Mexican politicians being involved. There's cases documented of this. And then you have the Mexican gangsters expropriating this trade from the Chinese community violently. And it happens during a wave of anti-Chinese racial violence in Mexico that plays out in the 1920s and the 1930s. During the whole Mexican Revolutionary period, there was people in the Chinese community that done well for themselves, had businesses, and so you have these politicians leading racial violence against the Chinese minority there, and then also criminals taking over the Chinese opium selling, and then it turns into heroin, and that's the beginning. Going through the history of heroin, which is there. Then you have a crazy episode in World War II where the United States needs more morphine for its troops, and the traditional route of opium poppies is from Turkey, which is cut off because of the war. So the story is they went to Mexico and made a deal with the Sinaloans then to buy opium poppies to use for the US military. It's a very hard story to confirm 100%. The Americans went on denying it into the 1950s, but the Mexican authorities believe it to the point where the Mexican military, in a museum they have that as the official story. They say that then the official story, the American military came down and bought opium from the what in those days was the very, very beginning, the very, very early genesis of the Sinaloa cartel.
Even without that, just the idea, it's just this absurd butterfly effect, this idea of these Chinese laborers coming there, bringing these plants and it leading to what it is now. I remember it just kind of blew my mind. It was fascinating. Is there any sort of similar historical, just downright weird and shocking turn of events that you found with guns?
Sure, yeah. So I looked at the evolution of three things, I think, with this. There's the evolution of firearms themselves and the AK-47. The role of, people say assault rifles, that term itself is disputed by gun enthusiasts. You don't want to tweet about that because they'll come for you. This rifle doesn't assault anybody. But I don't understand. It is a slight, when you get into the details, it is a slightly nebulous term. But basically, the idea of rifles which are automatic and semi-automatic, which can fire accurately over like 300 meters, 300 yards, which is really where a lot of the fighting can take place, which can be easily reloaded, have a lot of bullets in the clip, and can easily reload them. And the AK-47 really defined this, and then the AR-15 or the M16 came to compete with this. And there's some crazy stories about when they first were creating the M16 in California, in Hollywood, because that was the place that was in of all places. I went to the place where they invented the AR-15, which is now like in its place now is actually a pet vet place, and near you see marijuana dispensaries and gay bars. But back there was the place in Hollywood where they invented the AR-15. And there's this one crazy story among this is that there were the U.S. military were looking at taking on the M16 as the main infantry weapon in the early 1960s to try and face off against the AK-47, and they wanted to test the weapon out. So first of all, they got a bunch of live goats, and they blew apart just all of these goats with AR-15s and M16s and AK-47s to compare. And then they brought in some actual heads, human heads, to blow apart with the guns, but they were imported from India. And they put in this kind of weird, because they'd been lost a bit of mass over them, they put in some weird like gel, and then we're blowing apart these heads and looking at
what year is that? What year is this?
This is the this testing was done, which is late 1950s, early 1960s.
I think there, if you got the money, I think there are still some places you can do that in Cambodia, but I've never heard of that happening in the US.
Blowing and so then the AR-15 was the M16 was made the main military rifle. Then you had the civilian version which came out. Now, what these weapons do, the AK-47, the M16, the AR-15, the FAL, the German, the Belgian rifle, the FAL, the German rifle, the Heckler & Koch. What these rifles do is they kind of redefine warfare, but also they allow, you see then the kind of guerrilla warfare that we see, and the latest things of the ISIS fighting, the Islamic State fighting, and these kind of things, and also the cartel warfare, all gets kind of equalized with these rifles. So the way that, part of the reason that the cartels can be so effective, or the Islamic State could be so effective, or the Taliban could be so effective, or going back to the Mujahideen, is these rifles. And you have this leveling out. So to understand the way you have this weird hybrid war in Mexico, a big part of it is, it's the AK and the AR-15. The AR-15, they buy them in the United States, a huge amount of these. They also steal some from the Mexican military or from various militaries. A huge amount come from the United States. and they'll convert them from semi-automatic to fully automatic. But if you look at a lot of the way that actually the war is fought these days, that distinction between the semi-automatic and the fully automatic is not really a game changer. I mean, actually, most of the time when they're fighting, you can do pretty much a huge amount of damage with a semi-automatic. You don't really need on full auto. But they will make them full auto a lot of time in Mexico, and that's why you'll see these crime scenes where they'll spray 500 bullets and they'll kill everybody in the car, and then the person in the car behind, and the woman in the car behind going to work, and the guy selling tacos on the corner. They'll wipe them all out. They're just going to spray 500 bullets from a whole bunch of guys with these rifles.
Yeah, you talk about that a bit in the book. That story that got a lot of attention, I think, a year or two ago with the Mormon families that were just in explosive amounts of weaponry just aimed at them and shot them up. Another thing you kind of talk about at the end, which I think is actually really important, is about the Mexican journalists that you've known, and also, I guess, the ones that you haven't, that have been gunned down while covering what's happening in the country, and with some of these guns that have been brought over the border. How much of an issue are we still seeing of that in Mexico right now in terms of journalists being targeted, journalists being murdered? I've reported there, and you meet these guys who, they're not making a lot of money. They're mostly broke, and they just deal with threats on a weekly basis from the scariest people on earth, like cartels are threatening, and they just keep doing their jobs because they believe in what they're doing so thoroughly. And I was just kind of blown away by the dedication and like how much they care and how fearless they are in doing this kind of reporting.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a complete tragedy. Another part of this huge tragedy, the violence against Mexican journalists. If we look since 2000, good numbers show there's more than 150 Mexican journalists who have been murdered in this time. It continues at horrific levels. I mean, we look at 2020, it was another terrible year for killing Mexican journalists. They're murdered now. The circumstances in their murder are murky because the Mexican justice system is so bad. Because the Mexican justice system is so bad, it's not actually solving these cases. Sorry,
it's all good.
So maybe I should have turned that off. So, because the Mexican justice system is so bad, it's like not solving these cases. But we see a lot of them who are covering the crime beat. Some of them are also covering politics, or covering the intersection of organized crime and politics. And we've seen a couple of cases. One recently of a politician in Chihuahua arrested in connection with the murder of a journalist, and before also a mayor who was arrested, who has been indicted for the murder of a journalist. Just recently, I was in Veracruz, and I was with this guy whose father was killed, who ran a local newspaper in a part of Veracruz. And his father was in their family house, and 6 gunmen came to the family house, took him away, and brutally murdered him. And his son is now continuing doing his work. So he is in that same house where they came, doing it. And I was just like, I just, step down to your bravery, the bravery he has facing this off there. And I mean, 2 journalists who I personally know, work with. One was a good friend, Javi Valdez. Another journalist in Michoacan who I work with, who's disappeared, have died in this violence. So it's something which is absolutely horrific and carries on. It's one of the worst places in the world for this.
Do you personally worry about this sort of thing targeting yourself? I mean, I know when I've gone down in Latin America, there's almost like it's the ultimate sort of Westerner privilege where you feel like you yourself aren't at a tremendous amount of risk, but when it comes to the local journalists that you're working with, it's a whole other story. I mean, do you feel like you've been under threat at times?
Yeah. I mean, although as you say, you're definitely more protected for certain reasons. Like if a gangster in Tamaulipas killed a local journalist there, there's very little comeback. Whereas if they had to kill an American journalist, then that could create a lot of pressure. But at the same time, you should never feel immunity. I mean, bullets can go through, don't recognize nationality or race. If you're in these areas, there's shootouts happening. If you're in these areas, there's 15-year-old kids with AK-47s. How much are they going to be stopped by this? And then we see the history of journalists, foreign journalists who have been killed. I mean, in places like El Salvador, going back to French filmmaker Paul Berda was killed.
Yeah.
The movie La Vida Loca. And recently in Mexico, whereas we haven't seen American or European journalists being killed, there's been quite a lot of regular Americans who have been killed here. And there's cases where, there's the case of Harry de Vert, who was a kid who was just biking across Mexico and was killed and was cut up. His body was cut up. And I talked to his mother who came down here looking for her son. It was a tragic story. More recently, there was a guy who was like a U.S. school teacher who was hanging around in Chihuahua, and they accused him of being DEA, and they killed him. One should never feel any kind of immunity with this. And there's many situations where it's difficult. But I do at the same time don't want to dramatize when you have in the face of you 150 Mexican journalists who are being murdered, and then Mexican journalists who've got refugee status in the United States, Mexican journalists who have, hundreds who are in a protection program, a place here in Mexico City, then I don't want to compare what journalists have been through to that. But, but it's no picnic either.
Yeah, no, I mean, especially now you've got this new book coming out. I'm sure that there's always that sort of concern, and having been there decades doing this kind of work. I think that's about it. Is there anything else you want to add? I mean, I your books in general, I think our audiences would love them, whether Gangster Warlords, which we didn't get to talk about too much, El Narco, and Blood, Gun, Money, which I think is just coming out in February, or it's been out.
February 23rd is release date.
Yeah, I'm really excited to work through the rest of it and read the whole thing, because what I've read so far, it's already terrific.
I mean, I guess the last time I liked, with all this stuff, there's trying to be positive about this, and can some of this be like an era that's going to end? I mean, it's got to end sometime. I mean, sooner or later, there's got to be some end to this. Some of these levels of violence. It might be a long time first. Things might get a lot worse first, but at some point, and there is chances. I think there's been changing with the drug policy reform. With legalization of marijuana, there is movement with that happening, and with the US, with these problems linked in the US, with the problems of gun violence, another time rising in the US again. So for a while, we saw this period of Mexican violence just going up and up, and US violence going down. So that was one of the reasons, why there was this kind of relationship, was that, you saw in that period of 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, US violence going down to some kind of historic lows for a while, and Mexican violence going up and up. But then now we've seen the US violence bouncing back, for a couple of years, and then pretty bad in 2020. And a lot of mass shootings in the United States. So maybe people can look at these problems together and see some hope of change.
That's good. Well, and then on a positive note, which we rarely get to do here, especially when discussing like these topics.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for your time. Please go out. We'll have his books up on the website. And thank you again for your time and for your reporting.